What is the first thing you think of when I say the word monster? Does your mind conjure up images of glinting fangs and glistening scales? Or perhaps glowing red eyes? Or even big scary werewolves? Despite what the word means to you, it has been our language for, well, a long time. And as you may have guessed, the threatening visage that would be invoked in the minds of listeners hasn't always been the same. Hello everyone, welcome if you are new, and thanks for coming back if you're not. But to everyone, thank you for tuning into this video. I appreciate you taking the time. A time period that's fascinating to me, as well as to some of you, I'm sure, especially if you're a guy around my age, is the medieval ages, which specifically is medieval Europe, which span about roughly late 5th century to around 15th century. So I'll spare us both a hastily written and perhaps poorly comprehensive recap of the medieval or Middle Ages. But of course, I will give explanations for words, concepts, and cultural happenings that are directly pertinent to what we're talking about. And what is that? Well, when I was deciding what topic I wanted to do for this video, I was browsing a rather large and intimidating collection of books, you see. And again, like any guy out there, my eyes immediately caught the word medieval printed across the spine. And of course, the next logical thought was, sick, let's do it. And the book in question is this, Medieval Monsters, Terrors, Aliens, Wonders by Sherry C. Lindquist and Asa Simon Mittman, with a preface by China Mieville. And I'm very sorry if I pronounced any of those names wrong, but I hope I at least nailed the title. As I alluded to earlier, the images conjured by the word monster have changed over the years, and you'll understand more by what I mean in a bit. But let's look at the word's etymology and try to get a better grasp at the word's inception to further understand what the original audiences envisioned. This comes from etymonline.com, and it says the word monster came about in the early 14th century from the Old French word monster. And I apologize, but that's as an authentic French pronunciation as I'm capable of. But this word means monster or monstrosity, as we understand it. And this is from the Latin word, quote, monstrum, divine omen, especially one indicating misfortune, portent, sign, abnormal shape, monster, monstrosity, figuratively, repulsive character, object of dread, awful deed, abomination. A bit harsh, but this word is a, quote, derivative of maniere, to remind, bring to one's recollection, tell of, admonish, advise, warn, instruct, teach, end quote. And you'll see, especially in this medieval setting, that a lot of depictions of monsters end up representing antitheses or juxtapositions to the divine. They personify an affront to God's ordered design. And let's look at an example given in the introduction of this book. A great example of a piece of work that illustrates monsters in the medieval period is the Psalter world map found on page 13. And you might be wondering what a Psalter is. And it's a small book containing specifically the Psalms of the Bible, which is an Old Testament book of songs, mostly written, according to Dr. Scott Hahn and Curtis J. Mitch in the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible, by King David, who is credited with composing 73 of the 150 songs, with other attributions belonging to his son, King Solomon, as well as Moses, Asaph, Jeduthun, Heman, and Ethan the Ezrahites, and the sons of Korah, but over 30 are left unattributed. You're most likely familiar of the first half of what is probably the most quoted psalm, which is Psalm 23, reading, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." This is among some of the shorter psalms in the Old Testament book, but they all follow this general outline of being songs praising, worshiping, or giving thanks to God. But there are 150 of them, so they encompass the whole spectrum of human emotions. So there are plenty of those that also cry out in anger, confusion, grief, or sorrow, such as Psalm 6, which in verses 1-3 and 6-9 read, "O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor chasten me in your wrath. Have mercy on me, O Lord, for I am languishing. O Lord, heal me, for my bones are troubled. My soul also is sorely troubled. But you, O Lord, how long? I am weary with my moaning. Every night I flood my bed with tears. I drench my couch with my weeping. My eye wastes away because of grief. It grows weak because of all my foes. Depart from me, all you workers of evil. For the Lord has heard the sound of my weeping. The Lord has heard my supplication. The Lord accepts my prayer. And full disclosure, I am a Christian, but it's not expressly why you might notice a Christian through line in this video. But the reason why is, well, we're looking at around 11th to 15th century medieval Europe, which encompasses a time frame when the Catholic Church is generally considered at the height of her influence, and the Protestant Reformation didn't kick off until the early 16th century. So we're speaking about Christians here. We're either referring to largely Catholic or Orthodox Christians. But this book examines more Western European artwork and illustrations. So that means that the creators and their audiences that we're looking at today were generally Catholic. And if you're just generally curious about where the separation lies, more Eastern areas following what is known as the Great Schism of 1054 identified as Orthodox, and many still do. But think of places like the Byzantine Empire, which encompass Constantinople, or known nowadays as Istanbul, and Greece and other areas as well as Slavic areas like current-day Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. So since Catholicism is the prominent backdrop of the artwork we'll be looking at, consider the whole 9 yards, like the papacy, the priesthood, as well as devotions to the Holy Trinity, the Blessed Mother Mary, and the heavenly saints, among other things as well. And also, when there's mention of liturgical ceremonies, we're talking about things like Mass, the Holy Sacraments, vigils, and other similar things. And Catholicism being such a big part of the cultural landscape, of course, means that the faith heavily influenced or even directly undergirded all the works we'll be looking at. And, I also personally find it interesting, but I'm explaining all of this because I thought this was important groundwork to lay before we dive in. So the Psalter world map, it would often be included, as Lindquist and Mittman explain, at the, quote, beginning of a Psalter, which was likely produced for English royalty around the year 1265. Measuring less than 3 inches in diameter, this tiny map presents its viewers with a medieval notion of a divinely ordered universe, which is organized from top to bottom and from center to margin. End quote. So this is why I preface these historical works with a Christian backdrop, because you'll immediately notice that at the top of the map is, well, Jesus, who is gesturing a blessing with his right hand, and 2 angelic figures attend to him on his left and right, and they're swinging incense, which burning incense for religious purposes is a practice that dates back thousands of years, even outside of Christianity. And in an article written by Matthew D. Herrera that explains the historical application of burning incense in the Catholic Church, he writes that, quote, in the Old Testament, God commanded his people to burn incense. He also points out that one of the uses of burning fragrance is this, quote, incense is a sacramental, used to venerate, bless, and sanctify, end quote. So we see the use of swinging incense burners in liturgical ceremonies for different reasons, from all the way back then up to the current day, and it's common too. Lindquist and Mittman point out that on the opposite end of the map, situated at the bottom, are 2 creatures that look like an amalgam of multiple animals, which is a recurring theme we'll see. The authors also point out how, as with most maps from the Middle Ages, the world is oriented with East at the top and Jerusalem in the center. At the southern edge of the world, that is the far right side of the map, the painter added an array of monstrous people set against a backdrop of alternating blue and orange bands. So there are a couple of interesting things here I think we could talk about before examining the gross little creatures on the side of the map. Firstly is the central point of Jerusalem, and it was news to me to learn that medieval maps pinned it dead center until I read this, and I suspect it has to do with the reputation of the city. It isn't just considered holy and significant in Christianity, but in all of the, as they're generally grouped, Abrahamic religions. It's significant in Christianity for a plethora of reasons, but to name a few, not only because it's a prominent focal point in the Old Testament, so it has a lot of significance to Judaism, but it's also where King David established it the capital of Israel, and where King Solomon, King David's son, established the temple, but also a pretty important strings of events occurred there in the New Testament. The belief is that Jerusalem is the culmination of Jesus' earthly ministry. This is the place where he rode in, being heralded with cries of Hosanna, Hosanna, which means save us, we beg you. It's also where he was crucified, bearing the sins of all mankind and tearing the veil between man and God in two, and where he was also resurrected in his glory, defeating death. The significance of the city continues to this day, making it a huge pilgrim destination for the faithful, particularly the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Well, more so for Catholics and Orthodox Christians, which is the location of Jesus' crucifixion and burial, initially erected as early as the 4th century by Constantine the Great, who's actually recognized as a saint in the Orthodox faith. And regardless of whether you believe any of this or not, this kind of framing, even if you're looking at this with curiosity, can help us align ourselves closer to the mindset the original audience probably had, especially when composing maps with such significance placed around the figure of Christ in the city of Jerusalem. Another interesting point, and this may be off base, so feel free to consider it conjecture, but I wonder if the fact that, if I understood the allocation correctly, the west is situated at the bottom of the cardinal directions also has a religious basis. The east is considered more explicitly in the Orthodox faith as being revered as a direction pointed and oriented toward God and Jesus Christ. And also, Genesis chapter 3, verse 24, speaks of the way to the tree of life toward the east of the Garden of Eden. So there may be some significance there as well. The opposite direction, west, is associated with the devil. And an interesting rite performed for those who join the Orthodox faith is that they will make a public display of rejecting Satan. The faithful will turn to face west and spit, renouncing the adversary and separating themselves from him. Then they would face east and make a profession of faith and unity with Christ. The Orthodox faith also constructs their altars to face east, so the faithful are turned corporally towards this direction during worship. And I think Catholics do in some instances, but I think the former is more dedicated to this. So whether or not this is the reason why the cardinal directions are allocated the way they are in these medieval maps, I'm not certain, but it may be worth a passing thought at least. Okay, so let's look at the monstrous figures that encamp the corners of this map and examine the significance of both appearance and position. I think the easier of the two categories to distinguish, even at a passing glance, is the allocation of the figures on the page. Jesus and his angelic companions are set atop the world, while the dog-headed winged amalgams are pressed beneath it in what looks to be a rather tight and enclosed space. This clearly showing the way of the world and the divine orderliness of it, as referenced in a previous quote. Now, to the figures herded against the far right side of the map, Lindquist and Mittman explain they oppose the holy city of Jerusalem in a similar fashion because they are tucked away in the farthest margin of the map from the center. Now let's examine the appearance of the monsters and try to glean what the map makers believed. The authors continue, saying that these monsters represent more than just geographical distance from the holy figures and locations. A closer look shows how they form commentaries on what the owners of this little manuscript considered to be normal. For example, two of the monstrous peoples, the ones at the very bottom, farthest from Christ, are shown munching on human limbs. One is recognizable as an anthropophagic, person-eating, cynocephalous, dog-headed humanoid, while the other appears to be merely a human cannibal. These creatures differ in a number of important ways from the English royalty, who were presumably their first audience. Most obviously, the cynocephalus is a hybrid creature, part human and part dog, and thus its very existence is a threat to the vital categorical distinction drawn in the Middle Ages between humans, who descend from Adam, and animals, over which Adam is given dominion in the Bible. Furthermore, they break the most important of all food taboos by eating human flesh, an act that also threatened the human-animal divide. This threat to the order, believed to be established by God himself, and one that puts man in a position to subjugate the beasts of the earth, harmonizes with what the Bible teaches. This command is described in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, saying, quote, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the seas, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So again, whether or not you put much personal stock in these words, outlining them helps us understand where the audience was coming from, and what they considered the natural design of the world, and the laws that were put in place by the designer. So the authors bring up a great observation in saying that this categorical distinction is under threat when the crime of cannibalism is committed. Now, of course, The practice is not exactly celebrated nowadays either, and as you could have guessed, there was an additive disdain to the act as it violated scripture. Now, there isn't a direct command of thou shalt not commit cannibalism, but the imagery of men becoming like beasts was a clear one in the Old Testament during times of war or siege, when food ran out or was cut off. And those who were starving, in some cases, would feast on the flesh of kinsman and neighbor. One example being in 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 24 through 29, which, by the way, portrays the heinous act in a negative light. And this doesn't exactly abide in the command of loving thy neighbor. To further illustrate the unnerving role monsters served in medieval depictions, the author explains that, the very unattainable essence of their existence adds to their disturbing nature. And that sounded kind of pretentious, so I'll let Lindquist and Mittman speak for themselves. Yet, despite their significance, medieval monsters managed to escape easy categorization. Neither sacred narratives nor the writings of theologians could fully account for their existence. As the products of political, social, and psychological forces, monsters belonged in an unstable category of beings that break rules, disrupt social expectations, and cross boundaries. Whether as beasts or aberrant beings, medieval monsters possess a transformative power that made them at once profoundly dangerous and utterly fascinating. Perhaps this is what is most disconcerting about them. They are never entirely knowable. And this quality of being unknown, isn't that the essence of fear? Something that possesses a threat and brushes with or even oversteps the limitations of our knowledge, meaning we may not know how to identify it or control it. Perhaps that's why these depictions are left in the excess space in some cases, as the dog-headed wyverns encompass a space beyond the defined world. They exist in the same bluish sphere as Christ and his heavenly host. Humans may not know these creatures, their origins, abilities, or intentions, but God does. The divine has a watchful eye on those that escape our knowledge and grasp. And in the Salter world map, even those within the boundaries remain under his gaze. So that's why I think it's pretty telling that we not only examine what these monsters look like, but also how they are distributed across the page, because that alone could suggest something about the beliefs that the audience has held. This blurring of the knowable lines and overlapping categories is a running theme with the other depictions we'll be looking at, so keep all these observations put forth in mind. One final observation we can make about this piece that segues into another monster is reptilian qualities the creature at the bottom possess. As explained, they may be identified as wyverns, that is, dragon-like beings with 2 legs and generally barbed tails. The tails here, however, blossom into branches, leaves, and clusters of fruit. Moreover, wyverns and dragons were frequently considered to be types of serpents, a designation that carried satanic associations in Scripture. For example, the serpent that tempted Eve, and those mentioned in the Psalms and again in the Gospel of Luke as having been trampled underfoot. In medieval art, Christ is often depicted trampling a serpent, and the position of these wyverns beneath Christ, presumably at his feet, may allude to his power over them. Perhaps this explains why they seem to cower and crouch beneath the world, despite their fearsome appearance. The imagery of Christ crushing the head of the serpent, which is the devil, is seen as early in the Bible as Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, saying, quote, "I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." End quote. This is God speaking to the serpent that tempted Eve, and Christian tradition maintains that the seed in this verse is Jesus. And Catholics hold a holistic approach, saying that the woman spoken about, of whom Jesus is the seed, is Mary, the Blessed Virgin. To Christians, this text is viewed as a messianic passage, that is, one foretelling the coming messianic king. So this kind of imagery in medieval art would make sense when viewing serpentine amalgams. And while we're on this topic, I can't help but think of another monster that has been illustrated in medieval times, but is also familiar in a different way to modern audiences, and I'm talking about the basilisk. So this was a rather deflating segment of research because I thought I was being real slick by transitioning from the serpent's notoriety into a Harry Potter reference. But the first site I went to learn more about the basilisk in medieval contexts did the same exact thing. So maybe I'm not all that creative after all. but I'm going to go through the motions anyway. So we know how the ending of the Chamber of Secrets, spoiler warning, by the way, for this over 20-year-old story, but Harry encounters a very large snake that can turn people into a stone with just its gaze. I imagine this monster is probably the image people conjure up when they hear the name basilisk, and while there are reasons why this would make sense, as the historic basilisk is also called the Serpent King, whose venom is potently deadly, as well as its gaze and breath, but actual visualizations of the monster may not look how we expect. The image you'll probably stumble across, if you were to look it up, would be of what looks like a great big chicken, at least in some images, with talons and wings that are large and powerful, like an upscaled eagle's. In others, it retains its poultry visage, but its body takes on the form of that of a wyvern, being scaly and green, with a long serpent's tail. Regardless of which image you observe, a through line with all these depictions that they all look like pieces of different animals stitched together, relating back to that violation of categorical distinctions we talked about earlier. The lethality of the beast is quite extensive, and practically anything it does can cause great harm or death. According to the medieval bestiary, quote, "Fire coming from the basilisk's mouth kills birds, and its glance will kill a man. The touch and breath of a basilisk kills bushes, scorches grass, and breaks stone. Other animals will not eat or even touch any animal that was killed by a basilisk," end quote. Sounds pretty deadly to me, and this strikes me as one of those beasts you might overhear a kid come up with on the playground to be the other kid's monster. And I'm not saying that to be mean, but listen to this. Quote, "The poison of the basilisk is so strong that if one is stabbed with a spear, the poison will flow up the spear to infect the person holding it," end quote. So this is what I mean when I say I get the vibes that this sounds like two kids playing pretend, and one goes, "I just attacked you with my firebolt attack," and then the other will respond with, "Nuh-uh, I activated my force field, which reflected your attack, destroying you instantly." Maybe the lore surrounding certain monsters may be hyped up like this, so whenever someone was to slay a beast, they would be granted heroic titles, and then maybe someone else would go out and slay an even more deadlier foe, one-upping the previous person, which may seem analogous, or maybe it's just me. Except there's a funny little Achilles heel with the basilisk, and that is its arch nemesis. One common weakness the beast has, and there are a number of depictions showing the monster being accosted by this powerful foe, which is a member of the Muscelidae family, the weasel. When thinking about what could possibly kill what seems to be an apex predator, the medieval bestiary tells us that, quote, "The only animal that can directly kill a basilisk is the weasel. The weasel enters the cave where the basilisk lives, causing the basilisk to flee, but the weasel catches and kills it. Sometimes the weasel may itself be killed in a fight," end quote. Now you may be wondering how this animal could do this, and I'm not entirely sure. But when I look at the medieval bestiary's entry on the weasel, and yes, there exists medieval lore surrounding weasels, I suspect the reason may be this. Quote, "It is described as a bold animal that fights with snakes, and when it has defeated them, it eats them, and soon afterwards it eats the herb roux that counters snake venom. It kills snakes because they eat mice, and the weasel itself likes to eat mice," end quote. And since basilisks are part snake and produce venom, I suppose the ingenuity of eating the antidote after a scuffle makes the weasel a formidable opponent. And also, here's an interesting little factoid about the weasel's medieval lore, and this is more analogous or a moral application of the term weasel, so don't take it literally, but apparently, quote, "Weasels signify people who, willing hear the seed of the divine word, but then do nothing with what they have heard," end quote, which is very similar to a category of people who let the word die away after hearing it, outlined in one of Jesus's parables, the parable of the sower, in the book of Matthew. And since we have this Christian backdrop, I just saw this little fact while researching and thought it would be a potentially relevant thing to include. I don't know, maybe you could use it as an icebreaker. But now that we looked at reasons why monsters may have found their way onto the stained yellow pages of yesteryear, and what they signified about the outlook of those who designed or commissioned the designs of these pieces at the time, let's transition into an interesting offshoot to the lore. And that is how they were purposefully utilized to augment or accentuate a figure's status, Lindquist and Mittman explain. In ancient and medieval art, monsters often lent their fearsome presence to high-status individuals. Rulers built palaces, tombs, and temples, showing themselves defended by, or even in the form of, fierce guardian figures. Likewise, nobles and clerics, who saw themselves as earthly deputies of heavenly power, embellished their clothes, books, and luxury objects with a range of monstrous imagery that reinforced and dramatized their authority. Such motifs were often thought to have not only a symbolic potency, but also actual power in warding off evil. In addition to the perceived protective benefit of wreathing oneself in such powerful imagery, the authors also point out how these monstrous figures also generated awe in the medieval viewer. Large-in-life figures had their prowess and bravery inflamed with depictions of their acts conquering deadly, mind-bending monstrosities, which stick around as we'll be looking at a few examples in a moment. Other figures, given the awe-inspiring aspect of these creatures, would be uplifted when simply in the proximity of the beasts. Indeed, it seems the monster's unknowable and uncategorizable nature, again brushed with or extended beyond the comfortable limits of our sorting system. So certain depictions would, as the authors point out, awe us and give us a sense of amazement or something out of this world. And, as we can observe, the faithful found a way to reconcile their existence. Lindquist and Mittman offer us this, quote, "Because of their efficacy in communicating a sense of awe, it is not surprising that monsters found their way into the most sacred of contexts, scripture, liturgical objects, and religious sanctuaries. Theologians declared that such beings were part of God's cosmic plan, but they were terrors testifying to his awesome but unknowable essence. This relates to observations we made when looking at the Psalter world map, that those dog-headed wyverns remain outside the boundaries of mankind's knowledge, but not God's. The beasts may share in a glimpse of the Almighty's mystery, but they do not match nor eclipse it. Therefore, the Christian isn't scandalized by their existence, but instead they may cast their eyes heavenward, affirming their trust in the grand designer's ways and meekly submitting to his providence. So, let's look at an example of these two functions monsters also had in some depictions. The functions that augmented a figure through assimilation or proximity with the person in question. In a prayer scroll from the 1500, which aims to protect the adherent from the dangers of super or preternatural forces, we can see many illustrations of ravenous or hostile beings. The authors outline, quote, "Throughout the scroll, holy figures are juxtaposed with the forces of evil embodied by the creatures lurking in the margins, as well as a number of other more formidable fiends that openly challenge some of the saintly warriors," end quote. We'll examine a few figures in detail in a second, but let's take a moment to appreciate the cover of the roll, which across its, quote, 9 pieces of parchment sewn together, spans nearly 20 feet when unfurled. The image looks like this, and I want to take a brief detour and expand upon something the authors note here. Are you familiar with heraldry? According to the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, it is, quote, "the practice of devising, blazoning, and granting armorial insignia, and of tracing and recording genealogies," end quote. Or, more broadly, quote, "an armorial ensign or insignia." Think of those elaborate designs or even patterned shapes or formations across shields, and they're meant to be a sigil or representation of the group yielding them. Could be from some royal family, mercenary band, or organization. And a herald would have been an individual who matched the first description, one who could identify insignias or ensigns, while also able to trace genealogies. They also served as messengers for armies, usually being the ones who would deliver terms or messages from one army to another, or an opposing one. Now let's appraise the image and see what's going on here. Given this is a Christian prayer scroll, it would be fitting that the armorial ensign would pertain to Christ. So we can see his crown of thorns and, quote, 3 large nails pierce the top and bottom of the crown, while symbols of the 4 evangelists look on from the corners of the first section, end quote. And the 4 evangelists, by the way, refer to the 4 authors of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who are all canonized saints, of course. And this striking image will be sure to embolden the viewer, and indeed, according to the authors, it promises that those who bear the scroll on their person and who say certain prayers will have, among other benefits, sufficient goods and protection against sudden death, false witness, wicked spirits, fever, and pestilence. In an age of chivalry, the crown of thorns, nails, and other instruments of the Passion were called the Arma Christi, the heraldic arms of Christ. Another common translation of Arma Christi is weapons of Christ, and how appropriate it may seem, and to the authors who observe the application of them, that during this time when kings would display their might in heraldry, well then why not the King of Kings? And let's combine these things we have observed from just this opening image alone. The armorial ensign of the prayer book displays the weapons of Christ, which are the crown of thorns and the nails driven into his hands and feet, among other things. The imagery flourished in the face of evil upon this prayer scroll is that of Christ's passion, his crucifixion, death, and resurrection. This was the act that delivered the final and crushing defeat to the forces of darkness. Whether you believe this or not, you can understand that if we track this line of thought, that certainly the evil spirits and even the adversary himself, like a band of brigands who are hopelessly outnumbered and outclassed by an approaching army, would go running for the hills upon seeing Christ's coat of arms brandished before battle. So it's fascinating to look at it this way, because it would all make sense then why those who composed and fashioned the scroll would do so with such imagery. It all served a purpose, and they believe that there was actual power here, and you'll see there are more examples throughout this prayer roll. So as we travel deeper into the scroll, we begin to encounter these aforementioned holy figures, one being King Henry VI of England, who reigned from 1422 to 1461 and 1470 to 1471. And the latter reigning period may seem pretty short, because, well, let's just say he was a pretty controversial king, and not everyone was a super huge fan. And the authors point out, quote, the fractious politics of his reign resulted in disastrous civil wars, attributing in part to what some interpreted as his incompetence and possible mental illness, and others as his holiness, end quote. But the authors point out how during the reign of the Tudor king, Henry VII, reigning from 1485 to 1509, which is when this scroll was fashioned, Henry VI became a bit of a pseudo-saint, so there are some venerated parallels illustrated with him in this scroll. One of the holy parallels being with a highly venerated saint, St. John the Baptist, who is being displayed on the neighboring space to Henry. John was the son of the priest Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth, who was an older relative of the Blessed Mother Mary. He was also the one who baptized Jesus in the Jordan before his earthly ministry. An observation made is that both are robed in animal skin. While the king is endured in an exquisite pelt robe, St. John is a bit more rustic, I guess you could say. And there's good reason for this, because in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 3, verses 2 through 6, it is written, quote, the word of God came to John, the son of Zechariah, in the wilderness, and he went into all the region about the Jordan, preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins, end quote. And the next bit is a reference to a fulfillment of a prophecy in the book of Isaiah, which is an Old Testament book written 700 years before Jesus' ministry. Quote, as it is written in the book of the words of Isaiah the prophet, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Every valley shall be filled, and every mountain and hill shall be brought low, and the crooked shall be made straight, and the rough ways shall be made smooth, and all flesh shall see the salvation of God, end quote. Now, I'm not trying to just blast Bible verses at you for no reason, but since we've examined how even the smallest details of these pieces can be important, I wonder why the creator of the scroll would make a parallel between King Henry VI to St. John the Baptist specifically. Given the verses in Luke that I've just read and the perception of Henry VI as a pseudo-saint during Henry VII's reign, I wonder if the creator is making some kind of statement to the reception the former had. Maybe there were some ideas, gestures, or even vague notions of the prior king being some kind of herald or usherer of something. But this could just be conjecture. There isn't an observation, at least one I noticed in the book, so I could be off the mark. But I wonder if the role John served in God's plan of salvation may be relevant to the king he's being compared to. Both these figures, King Henry VI and John the Baptist, are shown with numerous monstrous creatures around them. The former stands upon a, quote, heraldic beast, end quote, and the shield he holds displays his, quote, hereditary status as divinely sanctioned king, which was connected to the claims of miracles later attributed to his relics, end quote. This display seems as though that Henry and the beast are in union, or that the monster submits and recognizes Henry as the royal figure he is, amplifying his status. St. John, on the other hand, seems to be facing off against the beasts, Lindquist and Midman observe. And calmly facing down a griffin and other predatory animals of the desert with this cross and associated Lamb of God imagery, John demonstrates the emuletic powers of the visual devices in the role, such as a cross, nails, heart of Jesus, and crown of thorns. This emuletic power is shown in the monster's weariness of the saintly figure and mirror what is believed to be the condition of the one who carries a scroll. Such iconography has power over harmful forces. It may not be a corporeal, big, scary monster chasing you down a hallway, but any misfortune or bad omens would be warded off by the imagery sprawled across the paper. Or it may be the fear of very real hardships and tragedies that would cause the faithful to clutch the scroll to invoke bodily or spiritual protection for themselves or loved ones. One example is outlined by the authors, saying, represented among the saints petitioning the scroll are those who helped in childbirth, Saints Margaret, Anne, and a mother and child pair, Julia and Kyricus. The prayers to them may have proved useful if the priest was called to the side of a woman in labor, a perilous moment given the high number of women who died in childbirth during this period. Indeed, the prayer to the Holy Cross explicitly instructs the reader to lay the roll in the womb of mothers in childbirth to ensure safe delivery. In such moments, Christians put the fates of their bodies and souls in the hands of the church, and this scroll attests to fears that they would end up in the claws of the terrifying monsters of hell. Laity and specialists alike engaged in and reacted to monstrous imagery or tales. Not only do the divine weapons of Christ repel and dominate the forces of evil in spoken or illustrated works, but, given this example of childbirth, the whole host of heaven is open to the petition of the faithful for encouragement, intercession, or deliverance. So as we have observed with John the Baptist, saintly figures are seen unwaveringly opposed to vicious beasts. Girded by faith and piety, when these illustrious men and women meet monsters, they are indomitable. The authors examine an interesting little book that was very common as a personal prayer codex called the Book of Hours, which contained a, quote, a calendar, readings from the Bible, excerpts from the liturgy, and prayers to Christ, the Trinity, the Virgin Mary, and the saints, end quote. There are examples we'll be looking at in this prayer book and others, but this section of our text is pretty exciting for our topic because it not only shows interesting or graphic depictions of monstrous creatures, but also shows human figures directly interacting with them. And there are a few different categories of interactions we see from the selected images within the pages. We can see saintly figures, 1, assailing and defeating monsters or demons, 2, controlling or taming them, 3, casually repelling the beasts simply with their own piety or holy aura. Lindquist and Midman kick off the section by explaining warrior saints were particularly popular among the knightly class, and such saints were frequently depicted demonstrating their martial prowess by slaying dragons or demons. For audiences familiar with the chivalric entertainments of their own day, stories like that of St. George, who rescued an imperiled princess from a dragon, no doubt held special appeal. A Flemish book of hours from the mid-15th century stages a version of St. George's legend outside what appears to be a contemporaneous Northern European city, recognizable by the massive 2-towered gates and Gothic turrets depicted in the background. Now, quick note, specifically about the Flemish St. George image, and that is I probably can't show the entirety of it on YouTube because the dragon is lying face up, and it possesses an outline of a certain external organ. So I won't be showing that corner of the picture. But the authors do make note of this, as the prominent display of it on the monster, quote, introduces the notion of sexual desires as a threat in the existential battle of good versus evil, end quote. And they point out how this is unusual to see, and there wasn't a single other illustration of the famous scene online anywhere that featured this anomaly. So if you want to look up St. George and see all the really cool artwork, then you don't really have to worry about it. But with that addressed, let's examine the saintly knight's escapade. This is one of the few images up to this point in the book that shows a person directly assailing a monster. But an interesting difference with St. George is that the illustration depicts not the opening strike of a battle, but the killing blow. we can see the patron saint of England encased from head to shin in armor, with sleeves of chainmail draping over his arms and an ornate helmet with no visor, sporting a colorful plume of 3 feathers. An interesting visual detail about the helmet's design is that the siding, where the ears would be, has metal flanking out and back, with spikes that look like spines and fan steel that looks like webbing, which almost looks like either a fin or, strikingly similar to some depictions of the monster he faces, like draconic wings. The others note how St. George's attire would look familiar to those of Flanders, who possessed this devotee's book, as the armor's aesthetic was favored in that territory. There are a few other aspects about this visual piece that are tailored to the contemporary sensibilities that further ground the legend to the viewer, such as the accessories he had as well. As pointed out, quote, the saint's high saddle was a type designed specifically to help knights avoid being unhorsed in a tournament. It was a sort of equipment used in courtly combat games rather than actual combat, end quote. Now for the beast. It's depicted with most of the qualities we might expect from a dragon, with its green, scaly skin, claws, and other reptilian features, but it's notably smaller than what us modern audiences would imagine, like it's smaller than St. George's horse. And this is actually something pretty common to every other depiction and illustration of the scene, and that makes me wonder if this is like that because there was just a fundamentally different outlook on the monster back then, or if it was a stylistic choice, like the beast, who was reeling from the assault with the broken off front half of the saint's lance impaled through its mouth, stands no chance against the holy agent, and the viewer would walk away thinking that good conquers evil yet again, and it wasn't even close. And in case you were curious about the historical figure of George, he was a Roman soldier who lived in the late 3rd century, and according to Britannica's biography on him, resisted the persecution of Christians under Diocletian during the early 4th century, and as a result, he was imprisoned, tortured, and ultimately killed, being beheaded. So even if he didn't slay a literal dragon, his courage and dedication to his faith made him a venerated saint among those of the knightly class, and even broadly to those Christians who aimed to be faithful and brave, even to the point of self-sacrifice. And he was eventually adopted as the patron saint of England, among other countries as well. Another image displayed, showing one taking the fight to the demons, goes even further and deepens the chasm between good and evil, and that is because the saint being shown here is the Archangel Michael. This is pulled from a book of hours in the early 16th century by, quote, famed illuminator Simon Benning, destined for a noble family of Portugal, end quote. And for those of you who know anything about St. Michael, you can imagine the scene would look like an utter trouncing, and it is. For those of you who don't know who he is, St. Michael is one of the few archangels we see in the Bible, and this term means high or chief-ranking angel. And 2 other archangels, well, 2 depending on the denomination you ask, are Gabriel, a, quote, Hebrew name meaning God is mighty, and he is the messenger who came to Zechariah to announce the upcoming birth of his son, John the Baptist, and to the Blessed Virgin Mary about her conception of the God-man, Jesus. And the other archangel is Raphael, which in Hebrew means God has healed, and he is sent by God to heal Tobit and Sarah in the book of Tobit, which is an Old Testament book one can find in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, but is absent from Protestant and non-denominational Bibles. Now, some biblical background for St. Michael to help illustrate why he is depicted the way he is in the artwork of the Portuguese Book of Hours. He is mentioned 3 different times across Old and New Testament books, and I want to recite the passage in Revelation, but I feel like I should make a quick asterisk for those who are not familiar with the book of Revelation, which is considered the hardest book in the New Testament to interpret. This book, also referred to as the Apocalypse book, is penned by St. John the Apostle toward the end of his life while in exile on the island of Patmos, the events within being relayed to him in the form of a vision. Now, he is the same apostle who wrote the 4th Gospel and the 3 epistles, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. When one looks at the Gospel of John and the book of Revelation, they have different literary styles and devices because they aren't in the same genre of writing. And as explained in the introduction to the book in the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible, Revelation is the only book of its kind in the New Testament. On the one hand, it is a work of Christian prophecy that has much in common with the prophetic books of the Old Testament, especially Isaiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Zechariah. On the other hand, it is also an apocalyptic book, with clear affinities to Jewish religious writings called apocalypses, which date from the same general time period. Examples: 1st Enoch for Ezra, 2nd Baruch, Apocalypse of Abraham. These works display a comparable range of cosmic symbolism, heavenly visions, judgment scenes, and angelic mediators. Okay, so with that building block set, let's now listen to the scene written by St. John involving St. Michael. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. The commentary on this verse elucidates the role St. Michael holds, the power given to him by God. Quote, Michael, the heavenly warrior and archangel, referencing Jude chapter 9, who protects the people of God, referencing Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, here he leads the heavenly army in the attack against Satan and his horde. Now, as mentioned earlier, this book's language is drastically different from the historical account of John's Gospel and epistles, with this apocalyptic text featuring grand language and imagery. So should you be taking every word in this book as literal as the Gospel account written by the same author? Well, no, probably not. But the scene depicted here does align with others displaying St. Michael's heavenly power as a strong warrior leading the charge of God's army of angels and protecting his people. So now we all have some context, let's finally check out this image showing the warrior in the Portuguese Book of Hours. We see St. Michael soaring gracefully with impeccably clean robes and a shiny golden breastplate. Below him, hurtling downward, is a group of monstrous-looking demons, a couple spitting out flames as they fall. Linguists and Mittman draw attention to the border of this piece, and that is a tapestry interweaving what initially seemed like bizarrely out of place natural imagery, such as flowers, insects, and a bird, all illustrated with great and meticulous detail, ground the scene playing out before us, bridging the gap from the scene to the viewer's world the authors offer. The realistic treatment of the objects in the margins seems to argue for the veracity of the vision of St. Michael in the center of the composition. Here the viewer is encouraged to experience the vision of the saint directly, as did John when he alleged that he witnessed St. Michael's great battle in heaven as described in the book of Revelation. The power and elegance of the warrior is overbearing to the monsters, as one may even interpret this scene as complete domination, as Michael's raiment and weapons are unstained or unscathed, and he, seemingly, holds his pose in anticipation of a strike, not the follow-through of one. It gives the impression that his mere approach is enough to catapult lesser demons back to the pit. This powerful imagery, in conjunction with the bridging technique of the border, quote, inspire confidence that he can and will intervene successfully on behalf of his earthly petitioners. The connection between the original reader and the angel is strengthened by having St. Michael wear the Italianate plate armor favored by the Portuguese court, end quote. Others point out that it is unlikely that the Portuguese nobility saw themselves equal or comparable to St. Michael, yet there was an admiration that they would hold for him, as both parties shared similar stations as warriors and judges. Now, we've looked at a couple of examples of saints who would rouse the masculine population, brave, holy men bearing arms to strike down evil, to either scourge the monstrous adversaries or to protect loved ones. But men do not have a monopoly on exemplified sainthood. Even though women during this time in Europe saw no station in military affairs, as they were not fitted with the gears or trained with the proper skills, except for a notable saint from France, Saint Joan of Arc, they did experience their own griefs and hardships. Indeed, monsters infested the lives of both men and women, yet the pious women who have been canonized still conquered equally vicious beasts, just in a bit of a different way. One of the most gruesome depictions, actually, of monster slaying offered among the pages of this book is from a prayer book created by the celebrated artist Jean Poyer, who belonged to the French royal court. During the late 15th century, quote, Poyer created a diminutive masterpiece for Anne of Brittany, who was twice Queen of France, a prayer book designed to introduce the future heir to the fundamental teachings of Christianity. It was probably commissioned in honor of the birth of Anne's first son, Charles Orland, end quote. And, quick note, of course, one of, if not the most venerated female figure to the Catholic, both then and now, is the Blessed Virgin Mary, who is featured in the prayer book being taught by her own mother, Saint Anne, who Anne of Brittany derives her own name from. Unfortunately, the latter wouldn't be able to instruct her heir like the depiction of the Holy Mother, as Charles Orleans passed away at the age of 3 in 1495. This tragedy alludes to the mention of monsters that lurked in the lives of medieval women as well, even in the domestic sphere. As this prayer book was highly personalized and showcased Anne, quote, modeling good Christian practice by confessing her sins to a priest, end quote. In addition, the royal youths shown on the last folio of the manuscript may represent the future king who is to learn from this volume. Had he survived, the book might have communicated to him something of the force of his mother's personality, whose motto was, "I will not be moved." The monster that reared its head in this instance was the deprivation of a mother's son, who, given the contents of this personalized book, suggests, at least to me, she loved him, and she was looking forward to raising her son and imparting her knowledge, time, and affection. But this was all taken from her, and she was struck with the cruel fate, with the small prayer book to remind her of what could have been. Now, along with the vignettes of Anne of Brittany carrying out a Christian's obligations, was a portrayal of St. Margaret, which is the image I alluded to earlier as being one of the most gruesome we've seen so far. The tale of the sanctified figure is as follows. She was tossed into a cell by an evil king, where a demonic figure appeared before her, and, quote, some stories say Satan himself in the shape of a dragon, end quote. Unlike how the story went in St. George's triumphal assault, a daring knight doesn't swoop in to slay this beast, saving the damsel in distress. Instead, the holy woman doesn't yield, as she makes the sign of the cross before the monster, causing it to flee or vanish, presumably in terror. You might be wondering what's so gruesome about that. Well, according to the authors, the most popular retelling of this encounter adds a cherry on top, punctuating her pious prowess. In this adaptation, the virgin is actually swallowed up whole by the dragon, but once she enters the belly of the beast, she then makes the sign of the cross, and the monster bursts open, abdomen parting wide in a red mess for her to emerge unscathed. However, noted about this act of St. Margaret bursting from the beast's belly is, quote, considered apocryphal and not to be taken seriously. And Lindquist and Mittman reveal this account comes from the Golden Legend, the most important collection of saints' lives from the Middle Ages, written in the late 13th century by Jacobus de Voragine, Archbishop of Genoa. And the reason why it was assigned this sterling title was because of the acclaim and respect it garnered, and also attention, as the accounts record the most, quote, dramatic rendition of a story, and therefore it was a favorite source for medieval artists, end quote. This visceral imagery can be seen in this rendition, as the beast the pure saint burst out of is lying on its side, tongue lolled out and eyes rolled to the back of its head. What remains of its middle section is a deep red cavern, exposing its intestines and ribs. While blood continues to pool around the corpse, St. Margaret is standing erect, white gown pristine, and she is in a prayer posture, looking onward while the rim of a holy glow emanates from her head, indicating the holiness of the individual, which we see in many depictions of saints. There are a few points of interest about this piece, as noted by the authors. St. Margaret, who is a patron saint to expecting mothers, ruptures from the belly of the dragon, or Satan. But if a soon-to-be mother was viewing this symbolically, then this is an interesting dynamic because Margaret would represent the child, while the carcass of the dragon would represent the mother. And it's noted how this might be a reflection of the horrors of the reality of maternal mortality, as, again, the rates were high during the medieval ages. The authors posit that this image would become, quote, increasingly meaningful to Anne of Brittany over the course of her life, as she had 14 pregnancies and only 2 children, daughters, who survived to adulthood, end quote. There may have been physical perils that were a more common threat to a man hoping for the intercession of the saints, but at least in this instance, Anne of Brittany was dealt a heavy emotional cross to bear, especially if being a mother to a son was a hope she had. But this is a reminder that both sexes had their own monsters to do battle with, but in the eyes of the faithful, it was by the grace of God there had been others who fought the same beast and conquered them. So anyone afflicted with anything under the sun has a saint to turn to for prayers, encouragement, and intercessions. There are plenty more rousing and fascinating and at times infuriating tales of saints, from men to women to children, who are beset with obstacles, challenges, and tragedies. But the connection among them is that they all maintain a strong grip on their faith in the face of any hardship, which very often resulted in the torture or death or martyrdom of the man, woman, or child. And many of them, such as St. George, truly did display almost fantastical levels of virtue, which would make the transition, or I guess addition, of other stirring events in their story a natural process. I'm not saying that every saint story is a work of fiction, of course, but it's fascinating to see monsters leveraged into select tales, whether on purpose or not, in good faith or not, which augmented the qualities these admirable people already possessed, or in some cases, were dormant until it mattered most. There are many ways monsters were portrayed by those who lived in the medieval era. They may be depicted as mysterious, unnerving, or uncanny entities that fail to neatly fit into our categories. This can be manifested in visual appearance or behavior, such as cannibalism, a great taboo at the time, as of course it still is. But these monsters could also have transformative roles, such as accentuating the prowess or complementing the holiness of a figure they are besieged by. Whatever role the beast served in a particular piece, they definitely weren't just set dressing. Were there any qualities or characteristics that stuck out to you or surprised you? I know there were a few for me, but I'd love to hear any thoughts or tales that you have your own, so feel free to drop them down below. And as always, again, I want to draw the spotlight to the book I got all this great information from, Medieval Monsters, Terrors, Aliens, Wonders by Sherry C.M. Lindquist and Asa Simon Mittman. So if you like what you heard here today, and trust me, we barely scratched the surface during our time here, then please support the authors by snagging a copy for yourself. With that, thank you everyone for watching. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to be here, and have a great day. I hope to see you all again. Take care.